Hello and welcome to another video trying to get you the really top grades. Today's top 10 is looking at Eva's timeline. And the reason this is important is Gerald spends so long in Act 3 trying to prove that everything that happened to Eva might in fact have happened to 5 different girls based on the inspector showing them different photographs. And therefore the inspector, according to Gerald, has just made up a person out of actions that the Birlings and Gerald have committed to different girls. Now, Sheila's point is that actually it makes no difference whether they're different girls or not. What matters is the evil intent or the consequences of those actions. But Priestley also sets this up to prove that Gerald is utterly and completely wrong. There are not loads of separate girls. There is only one girl. And I'm going to use the timeline to prove that. So if we follow through Eva's history, we can see that it cannot have been loads of different girls unless some sort of miracle of coincidence is going on. So fact number 1, Eva is sacked from Birling's in the last week of September 1910. This girl left us nearly 2 years ago, says Birling. Let me see, it must have been in the early autumn of 1910. Yes, says the inspector, end of September 1910. Now we know the inspector isn't lying here because he's shown the photograph to Birling and Birling remembers her. So we know this first instance must be true, and then all other dates will follow from this confirmed fact. Next, we find out that after 2 months of unemployment, Eva is employed at Millward's, the department store, and this is the beginning of December 1910. And it happened that at the beginning of December that year, 1910, there was a good deal of influenza about, and Millward suddenly found themselves short-handed. Now, this is a crucial bit of information because it tells us how incredibly lucky Eva was to get the job, and it tells us two terrible things about the economy at the time. Number one, your job was not protected if you got the flu. So if you got the flu and you were unable to work for a month, you could very easily get sacked. You didn't have proper employment rights. And, that's something that Priestley is campaigning about. But it also hints at something much worse than that. And that is the life expectancy of workers. Because very often influenza was fatal because there were no antibiotics in those days. And consequently, Eva getting the job could well be dependent on somebody having died. So here, Priestley's suggesting that an employee depends on the misfortune of others in order to be able to succeed themselves. The capitalist system is therefore inherently unfair. Next, we discovered that from January to February 1911, she worked at Millward's until she was sacked. Now, this date has to agree exactly with what Sheila has done. So we know that the girl who gets sacked from Millward's has to be the same one who got sacked from Birling's. Unless the inspector just got incredibly lucky and found out that Sheila had someone sacked, but that sacking occurred after Eva had been sacked rather than before. And the other problem is because Sheila is a regular at Millward's, because her parents have an account there after all, this is the place to go for clothing, and that's what women do in this play, at least according to Mr. Birling. She would know the employees. So if she'd sacked someone who'd been there for more than 2 months, the inspector wouldn't have been able to pretend that she was there only 2 months. And consequently, the dates have to fit the story. And it's highly, highly unlikely that this could have been a different girl. Now, the other thing that Priestley wants to emphasise here is that the girl was settling down nicely. She was doing a really good job. And that echoes what Birling said about her. She was doing a really good job at Birling's, and in fact they were going to promote her. Because Priestley is pointing out that in a proper capitalist system, where the market decides based on your profitability, how much you'll get paid, then someone who's good at their job would be able to not only remain in employment but earn more. Whereas here, because of the nature of the business owners, the Birlings here, the capitalist system is not working properly. They are not being paid a level that fits with how useful they are. So she should have remained employed by Millwards, but she got sacked. And she should have remained employed by Birlings, but she got sacked. The capitalist system is not working properly. And it's worth bearing this in mind, because Priestley isn't arguing for the country to overturn capitalism. He's asking for capitalism with a moral conscience. And it's the moral conscience that he says is lacking in these business owners and the rich. Now the dates coincide again. March and April to September 1911, Eva meets Gerald at the Palace Bar, the theatre, and becomes his mistress. Now again, Gerald knows these dates, so it would be highly unlikely that he's just suddenly found a mistress that coincidentally has these dates. And remember, this is super important, all the characters describe what Eva is like in personality. She seemed like a good sport. And they all describe what she looks like physically. Dark hair or brown hair and dark eyes and very pretty. And so what we have here is also not just random girls, but girls who look like each other, matching on the same dates. And that would be really unlikely for that to be separate girls. So were you seeing her last spring and summer? During that time you hardly came near me, asks Eva. And that completely matches the length of the affair that Gerald has, and it also matches with what's going to happen with Eva next when she meets Eric. So next, Gerald rejects Eva in the first week of September 1911. This is another crucial date because it's the date that Gerald's friend gets back from Canada, and it shows us that Gerald has got no reason to get rid of Eva. She's still from his point of view, his mistress. The only reason he gets rid of her is that she'll suddenly start to cost him money. At the minute, she's living in the friend's flat for free. Gerald's paying nothing. He pays Eva very little. But as soon as the friend comes back and Gerald would have to find another flat for her to live in, he would then have to pay for that flat. Suddenly, Eva is not worth the money. Now, you probably haven't thought of this, but if Gerald had used a prostitute during this time, that would have been significantly more expensive than having Eva as a mistress, not having to pay any rent and just giving her a little bit of money to live on and to save. So Priestley does this to show us that Eva's fate is even worse than that of a prostitute, because he pays her even less. He completely exploits her, but he pretends he does it out of a desire to help and out of affection. And then when we look at Gerald's words here, I can tell you exactly in the first week of September, you can see why he's got rid of her. It coincides exactly with his friend coming back. He's utterly, utterly callous, and Priestley does this to symbolise how rich men treat women. It is a callous contract. The other point that he's making is Gerald's marriage to Sheila is also not a love match. It is also a similar contract. And what he's doing here is implying that for Gerald, one of the main reasons to marry is going to be the alliance of the two businesses. And at the end of the play, the Birlings are still really keen for Gerald to marry Sheila, even though he's confessed to having an affair, because for them the most important thing is also that contract, the business alliance. They're going to not just remain rich, but grow richer and form a family dynasty of wealth down through the generations. And that's much more important to them than love, and Priestley wants us to find that horrifying. Now, the other bit of information that we need to consider is that the inspector didn't know about Gerald's affair with Daisy in advance. This is something of a surprise to him. He only asked Gerald to stay once he finds out that Gerald is going to become part of the family, that he's going to marry Sheila. He doesn't know what Gerald has done. Therefore, he can't anticipate that the woman that Gerald has had an affair with is in fact Eva. He doesn't know that in advance. But the fact that these dates fit so exactly again point to this being actual fact and not the inspector just manipulating them into believing that several girls were the same one they all had an effect on. Now we have to ask, why does Priestley do this? Well, he's trying to undermine Gerald's escape route, Gerald's desire to deny what he's been involved with. And the reason for that is he wants to show that this denial is a natural state for the upper classes. And he's making a wider point. The only way you can still keep faith in capitalism in its current form is to be in a state of denial about how it exploits people and actually ruins their lives. And so his play is trying to, if you like, take away the blindfold that the upper classes put on themselves and let them see the world and themselves as they really are. Now the inspector says that Eva went away to the seaside with the little money that she'd saved. And again, Gerald confirms that he gave her some extra money. So that exactly ties in with what Gerald says. And remember, the inspector couldn't know in advance that Gerald had given her the money. That coincides exactly with when Eric met her in November. Now, again, he doesn't know in advance that it was in November that Eric met Eva. He only knows about Eric's relationship with Eva and that he is the father of her child. So the inspector doesn't know all these dates in advance and therefore can't make sure that he has a plausible number of girls who would fit the timeline. Far from it. This must be the same girl. Then we have this bizarre courtship between Eric and Eva, which was late November or December 1911. Eva begins a relationship with Eric. Now, you have to take a view on whether Eric's description of how they first had sex is actually an account of rape or not, whether he's forced himself on her. But then this idea that then arranged to see each other is truly horrifying, because whether or not it was rape, he was certainly using his physical power as well as his wealth to convince Eva to let him in and have sex with her. And so this relationship is one which begins with him exploiting her. Now, you possibly haven't considered why Eva commits suicide by drinking bleach. And remember, this bleach doesn't just kill her, it kills her unborn baby. Well, bleach is a symbol of cleansing. She wants to cleanse herself, and what's been inside her, what's been in her inside, it's Eric. So this strongly suggests that he has raped Eva, and she's only with him out of economic necessity, but is in the end too disgusted with having to make this compromise and kills herself. And more importantly, she doesn't wait until she's given birth to do that. She wants to kill her baby as well. Why? Because it is Eric's baby and he is the person who's raped her, and therefore she cannot bear the fact of this child coming into the world. It's horrific. Now, Priestley never spells this out to us. He demands that we use our inference and intelligence to work this out for ourselves. So we know Eva is pregnant in December, and we know that by February or March 1912, Eva gets money from Eric, and he confesses it's about £50 all told. Now, at this stage, she doesn't commit suicide because she doesn't know that the money is stolen. And she's waiting to see if she can live with this compromise, this terrible compromise she's had to make of still being in a relationship with the man who has got her pregnant and has probably raped her in order to do so. She's obviously tried to forgive him because he was drunk, and she's obviously tried to forgive him because she needs the money. And this is an extraordinary amount of money. It's actually at least half a year's wages that he's given her. And that presents a bit of a mystery, because in April she goes to look for charity. And so actually this £50, we can infer Eric doesn't give entirely to Eva at all. He must be spending a lot of it on himself. So on the in April, we find out that 2 weeks ago she's gone to the Brumley Women's Charity Organisation, and we know that sometime before that she split with Eric because she found out he was stealing money. So she can't have split with him any earlier than February and no later than March. This again exactly fits the timeline. And again, if he's met her in November, we can see that she's spending money really quickly in order to have run out in March. So it's only, November, December, January, February. It's only 4 months, and she's already spent over 6 months' worth of wages. And this wouldn't make sense to an audience in 1945. They ought to be able to work out that there's something fishy going on here, and that Eric is probably pocketing the extra money that he's stolen. And this could be another reason why she chooses not to marry him. Now, she dies at a really significant time. So she dies in the first week in April 1912, and she commits suicide. How close to April Fool's Day must that be? Spring is symbolic of new beginnings, and of course the opposite is true for Eva. She's committed suicide. It's an ending. It's not a new beginning at all. However, the new beginning is also coming from her tragedy. And when he writes this play, Priestley's trying to suggest that this moment in 1912 could be the new beginning of when the upper classes start to lose their grip on power. And he wants that to come to fruition in 1945, which in fact it does, because the Conservative government is defeated and we have a landslide victory for the Labour Party, which is on the side of the common working man and working woman. 1912 is also really significant because it's at the height of the suffragette movement, where women are campaigning for the vote for the first time. Astonishingly, women weren't allowed to vote in an election at all. They simply had no voice, which we can see in the female characters in the play. So, Sheila has to marry Gerald if she wants to get away from her family, and Eva is totally exploited by all the Birlings, and in particular the men, especially Gerald and Eric, who use her for sex and abuse her financially as well. And one historical reference that Priestley is determined to use is the idea of the Titanic, which sails next week, and of course he tells us that it's utterly unsinkable. So the Titanic set sail on the 10th of April, and this marks the end, symbolically, of upper class supremacy. Obviously, it was it was from Birling's point of view, it was the super rich who went on the maiden voyage, and many of those, of course, were drowned. And so this is a symbol of how the upper classes are reaching a turning point, and they're being exterminated, if you like, by nature. And at the same time, many more working class passengers were killed because they were on the lower decks because of the class system. And again, it's another symbol about how the upper classes exploit the working classes, so the working classes suffer more. Now, this is the only date that doesn't quite fit, because when Birling rings up the infirmary, when Gerald rings up the infirmary, he finds that no one has committed suicide, and so it all looks like a fiction. But then the final curtain arrives with the second phone call. It's the police coming, because there has been a suicide. So what we've seen is Eva's timeline exactly matches, and it would be almost impossible to find different girls who have played each part and still have their appearance and character match Eva's. And consequently, we know that the attempt to persuade themselves that this is not the same girl is entirely self-deception, and that self-deception is a wider symbol about what's wrong with the upper classes. They are deceiving themselves about the appalling consequences of their actions on the working class. And Priestley kind of top and tails this in the play, with alluding straight away to the tragedy of those thousands of deaths on the Titanic, and then at the end of the play with the new suicide, apparently, of Eva Smith. So you're now in a position to be able to use these facts in a discussion of every single character. Birling, Mrs. Birling, Eric, Sheila, obviously Eva, and the inspector. You've revised all those characters just by looking at this 10-point timeline. So I hope your revision is going super well and that you will stay tuned for the next video. Don't forget to subscribe.